So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomás Amorim. I'm the academic manager of Mecila, the Maria Sibila Marian Center Conviviality and Equality in Latin America. A few quick words about Mecila. Mecila is an international center for advanced studies in humanities and social sciences financed by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Located in São Paulo, Mecila is an academic consortium composed of 3 German institutions, the Freie Universität Berlin, Universität zu Köln, and Ibero-Amerikanisches Institut. And 4 Latin American institutions, a Universidade de São Paulo, Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento, el Colegio de México e Instituto de Investigaciones en Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales, CONICET, de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata. The center aims at developing cutting-edge research through horizontal interdisciplinary cooperation among scholars from Germany, Latin America, and Caribbean, and other regions of the world. We offer fellowships of research stays here in São Paulo, and if you want to know more about this, please check our website, our social media, and our newsletter. So today we're having the first of a series called Mecila Distinguished Lectures, where renowned scholars who come for a short-term research visit in São Paulo interact with our fellows and offer the general public a talk on a relevant issue of their research. I'm very glad to introduce Professor William Scheuerman from the Indiana University, whose primary research and teaching interests are in modern political thought, German political thought, democratic theory, legal theory, and international political theory. Bill's most recent book is Civil Disobedience from 2018. He's also the author of Between the Norm and the Exception, the Frankfurt School and the Rule of Law, which won 2 prestigious awards, as well as Carl Schmitt's The End of Law, Liberal Democracy and the Social Acceleration of Time, Frankfurt School Perspectives on Globalization, Democracy and the Law, Hans H. Morgenthau, Realism and Beyond, and The Realist Case for Global Reform. Bill has published in many professional journals and is a recipient of numerous prestigious grants and fellowships. He also serves on editorial boards for a number of journals, and until recently, Bill was a North American co-director for the annual international conference for critical theorists held in Prague. He also wrote articles publicly defending whistleblower Edward Snowden. The subject of his talk today is, can politically inspired property damage or destruction be justified? The lecture will be in English, and questions may be asked in Portuguese or Spanish. The event will be recorded and made available on Mecila's YouTube channel. All of you who are here implicitly agree to appear on these recordings. I would also like to thank very much my colleagues from the Mecila team, especially Roberta Hesser, there she is, and also Mecila principal investigators, Professors Marcos Nobre and Bianca Favolari, for helping bring Bill.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas, for that introduction. Let me thank all the wonderful people at Mecila and Sagapi for letting me be here. I've learned so much from Brazilian colleagues on this trip. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm hoping we can continue the conversation, and I'm sure I will learn a lot more from you today. So again, thank you so much. If you go and listen to both popular and scholarly discourse about recent protest movements, you may have heard that for better or for worse, the days of nonviolent protest are coming to an end. That, at the very least, is a pretty common narrative out there. I don't know what it sounds like in this country. I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately. I'm grateful I can present in English, but this is certainly something that I have heard in political contexts in which where I can actually speak the language, and certainly in the scholarly discourse, this is what people are saying. From Portland, Oregon to Hong Kong, we are indeed seeing protests that include acts of militant, politically motivated lawbreaking that no longer seem nonviolent in the strict or conventional sense of the term. And by that I simply mean nonviolence as prohibiting both harm to persons and damage to or destruction of property. So what I want to do with you today is push back against this increasingly commonplace account. I think there's something to it, but I also think it's misleading in some very problematic ways. As I will try to argue, the broad understanding of violence that's implicit in this narrative gets in the way of us making the sorts of political and normative distinctions we have to make if we're going to make sense of what's happening out there with these protest movements, which obviously is an important thing for us to do. So let me just start with some concrete examples of what I have in mind, and I don't think these examples will probably surprise you very much. So first, and here's the first image, consider the massive Black Lives Matter protests that occurred initially in the United States 2 years ago. It seems like a long time ago, but just 2 years ago. And then, of course, they went global. That's also very interesting. A lot of these things just kind of suddenly explode, and people are doing it everywhere. This is, by the way, from Minneapolis in the immediate aftermath of these terrible police killings of some of my fellow citizens. Not too far from where I lived, a couple of kilometers, I was just telling Roberta. So this is South Minneapolis, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of destruction here. Now, there's no question the Black Lives Matter protests were overwhelmingly nonviolent in character. The empirical evidence is unambiguous. The social scientists are crunching the numbers, we like to say, and they really were strictly nonviolent for the most part. However, it is true that some protests included arson, looting, and vandalism, right? Look at the image. In some rare cases, there were physical injuries to protesters and, of course, also to political officials, police officers. In some very rare cases, there were fatalities. I mean, the first one, I think, 2 years ago in my country was a young woman in Portland, Oregon, who was shot by a police officer and died. So here's my second example. If you followed recent protests calling for action to mitigate climate change, there's no question most of the activists who are engaging in political lawbreaking are pursuing pretty familiar models of nonviolent civil disobedience. So this is true of Extinction Rebellion, which I think began in the UK and then also sort of went semi-global. In my country, the Sunrise Movement, which has been very active and very successful at pushing the Democratic Party to deal seriously with climate change issues. It's also true, I would say, with Ende Gelände, a movement in Germany. They're all, in principle, committed to old-fashioned, nonviolent civil disobedience. But here as well, we're seeing a growing number of calls for, and yes, increased incidents of environmental sabotage, ecotage is what we call this. I don't know the Portuguese word, so that's the English word. Gas pipelines, construction sites for new pipelines are getting vandalized, often under the cover of nightfall, by protesters who try to hide their identities. Now, obviously, these two women are not wearing masks. This is actually from an activist website, but I guess we're not supposed to see who they are, though I suspect if you really wanted to figure out who they are, you could probably talk to their cousins. This is, I think, in Canada on the U.S. border, and they're about to vandalize one of these new pipelines into the U.S. There's a book, I don't know if it's been translated into Portuguese, by a guy named Andreas Malm. You're nodding your head. Yeah, he's a Swedish environmentalist and Marxist who's basically making a very strong argument for sabotage. The book has just gotten a huge amount of attention in venues where you would not expect this sort of book to get reviewed. In very mainstream American liberal publications, people are treating it very respectfully, which I think is just evidence of how this kind of argument is catching on. My third example, this is Hong Kong, where there clearly was a tactical shift, I'm sure you all know, among the pro-democracy activists over the course of the last decade or so. This is a really discouraging example. So initially, the protesters embraced quite conventional ideas about nonviolent civil disobedience. So what does that mean? Well, they were committed to law-breaking that was public, that was civil, and that was intended to demonstrate respect for the law. If you were at the workshop earlier this week, we talked about definitions of civil disobedience. One of their leaders, a guy by the name of Benny Tai, he's an academic who has been fired from his position, and he was just released from jail. He spent 2 years in a jail in Hong Kong. He was a believing Christian who was inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King and Dr. King's ideas about nonviolence. He was one of the leaders of this movement early on. If you're a philosopher, you might also be interested in knowing he's a disciple of sorts, also of John Rawls. So he was somebody who thought very hard about doing nonviolent civil disobedience. And because he had to go and fight for what he believed in, no longer is enjoying the comfortable academic life that some of us enjoy. He's had a pretty tough time. And I think if Hong Kong hadn't been pushed to the sidelines because of all the amazingly crazy things going on in the world, you probably would have heard more about him than you likely have heard about him. He's a very interesting figure. Now, for political reasons that perhaps are understandable, this conventional form of nonviolent civil disobedience was not producing the desired results. Hong Kong activists came to embrace what another philosopher, Candace Delmas, she's from France but teaches in the US, she's a big voice in the debate today. describes and defends as uncivil disobedience. So this is law breaking that's often covert. It's not public. It's disruptive and morally offensive, so it's not civil in conventional senses of the term. It's legally evasive. You're not interested in showing respect for the law. You don't accept legal penalties. And yes, also violent, especially insofar as there is property damage. So obviously this idea of uncivil disobedience has been conceived in contrast to strictly nonviolent civil disobedience as it has typically been conceived. That final feature of these and many other recent protests, many of which I know nothing about, and I'm sure you can tell me about, they're going on here in Brazil, politically motivated property damage is absolutely crucial to these protests, and this is my main concern today. So let me just try to explain why I want to focus on property damage. Well, I think when commentators either lament or embrace the end of political nonviolence in this context, chiefly what they have in mind, I can't prove this right now, but I think this is really what they're talking about, it's property damage. Overwhelmingly, though admittedly not exclusively. That's the political violence that they're talking about. I mean, there are other forms of political violence, but this is really what's being discussed. That's at least what their examples are of. And at least on one level, this makes a lot of sense. In the examples I just mentioned, and in many other examples we could talk about, the so-called violence that we're seeing is actually not violence against persons. That has, empirically speaking, been quite marginal and typically very minimal. I mean, there has been some of it, but that's really not what this story's about. Okay? It's violence against property, or so-called violence against property. So in other words, the claim that political nonviolence is passé, that the era of nonviolence is coming to an end, I think is first and foremost a claim about the increasingly prominent role of property damage. Again, what we call in English, and I'm going to critically scrutinize these terms in a few moments, things such as looting, vandalism, sabotage, and so on. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think the answer to that question is pretty straightforward. First of all, we need to pay careful attention to politically motivated property damage, which of course is not intended to deny that other aspects of political violence are important. Of course they're important, and you'll hear me talking a bit about that in just a moment. Politically based property damage is happening, and I think it's happening quite a bit. So of course we have to make sense of it, politically, normatively, and yes, also legally. So some of what I'm trying to do with you today is suggest ways in which courts, legal officials should be dealing in a more differentiated way with this type of political protest. Another reason for this focus, a more academic reason, if you go and you look at these massive academic literatures on civil disobedience, nonviolence, political resistance, whistleblowing, and so on, the issue of politically motivated property damage is ubiquitous. It's all over these literatures, and I'm sure if you're familiar with some of them, you know this. But it's rarely, if ever, and I found this very interesting, analyzed in a systematic way. So it's mentioned, but just sort of marginal to what becomes the main arguments. So for both political and I think also for intellectual reasons, we need to do better. And so this is another reason why I think we really need to zoom in on the question of politically motivated property damage. So with your permission, I want to try to take a first stab at doing so. So here's the argument I want to make. First, I want to push back against the recent academic literature, but as you'll see, this isn't something that's just going on among academics. So I'm thinking of people like Delmas. I mentioned her already. She's talking about uncivil disobedience. But I'm also thinking of many others who don't advocate uncivil disobedience, but are redefining civil disobedience oftentimes, and political resistance as well, in very broad ways so as to include violence. They're defending these broad definitions of these terms in such a way that violence becomes part of them. Now, I think to their enormous credit, these writers are in fact beginning to lay out some political and normative criteria for analyzing and evaluating these things that are going on. However, and this is a polemical point among friends, if I may say, I worry that these mostly left-wing writers, and as you probably have noticed, I consider myself a person of the left, but I think, unfortunately, they too often are implicitly reproducing a problem that we find in the harsh, critical responses to militant protests that are coming from more mainstream, and I would say indeed right-wing positions. So I'm thinking of conservatives and others on the right, many others also, who instinctively describe even the most limited forms of symbolic property damage as terrible acts of violence. Now, if I were technologically more sophisticated, I'd have a clip of the Fox News coverage of the protest from 2020. I was sitting watching this with one of my daughters, who was a teenager at that point, and they were reporting on it, the toppling of a Confederate statue. And they talked about this, as my teenager quite astutely said, as though the zombie apocalypse was finally upon us. It had finally come. I don't know if you get this stupid cultural reference. I apologize. I mean, it's just so hysterical. Now, it's not just Fox News, unfortunately, right? If you go and you pick up, I don't know, the Portuguese dictionaries, you pick up standard English dictionaries, the definition of violence will often include property damage. I mean, this is just a very common way of thinking about these things. So the problem here is an overly broad, over-inclusive, and in my view, misleading understanding of violence, where violence without much of any justification many times refers both to acts harmful to and or destructive of person and acts harmful to and or destructive of property. So we see a conflation of violence against persons with property damage when, in fact, we need to treat them differently. Something, by the way, all modern legal systems actually do more or less, right? The lawyers know this. Property damage is sanctioned less severely, typically, than violent acts against persons. Unfortunately, if you look at the scholarly debate, also I think if you look at the political debate that we're seeing, that those debates fail to make similar distinctions. So even when the most sophisticated intellectuals, progressive intellectuals many times, sometimes describe and justify violent protests, more often than not, they're clumping property damage together with violence against persons. This leads to conceptual confusion. As a political theorist, that bothers me. And more importantly, for all of us, it leads to political confusion. And that's something all of us have to worry about. All right, so why delineate property damage from violence against persons? Well, I want to endorse, and if you participate in the workshop, you have heard this already, so my apologies for repeating this, but I do need to say a little bit about it. I want to endorse a limited view of violence. Why? Well, one problem with these broad views that we find out there, both in the scholarly discourse and in public debate, it's very straightforward in my view. Vandalized buildings, gas pipelines that have been damaged, they do not experience, I think I can say this with a high level of certainty, discomfort or intense pain in the manner we associate with physical harm to or violations of persons or perhaps other sentient beings, right? We could talk about that. That's a complicated issue. It's not just human beings. Properly understood, violence means subjecting human beings to physical and, yes, also extreme psychological pain and damage. Inanimate objects don't experience that kind of thing. I can drop my glass, it'll smash. Again, we can be sure it's probably not suffering, but when a torturer pushes somebody out the window, right, that's a very different sort of thing. I mean, you know, this is a serious matter, obviously, and I think that's why the sloppiness should worry us. So even when property damage can be linked to some tangible physical or psychological harm, so let's say a house is burned down, the occupants are homeless, they're traumatized, the relationship between the initiating act and the consequences is typically less direct and a lot more complicated than in commonly recognizable cases of extreme physical and psychological violence, right? A father beats a child, or a shooter fires a gun and injures school children, something that we have quite a bit of in the US, as I'm sure you all know. I worry that these broad notions of violence function as a confusing stand-in for a variety of complicated social phenomena. When you start calling all of these different things violence, you're missing all the complicated things that we have to analyze. They impede a sufficiently nuanced analysis that I think we need to do if we're going to capture the kind of differences that we need to make sense of. Now, if you think I'm being somewhat unfair towards these broader definitions, again, go and take a look. I don't know how familiar people are with this. At one point, I think it was quite common to read this in the social sciences, maybe less so today. A guy named Johann Galtung, who was a peace researcher. Now, a lot of people for a long period of time would talk about structural violence, but I think he was the fellow who in the 60s really systematically introduced this concept into the debate. Now, here's his definition, okay? He says, structural violence is present, and you'll see why I'm bothered by it, I hope, whenever human beings are being negatively influenced so as to impede their full potential. I mean, okay, that's something we don't like, but that's a lot of things. It occurs whenever, again, his words, the actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations, okay? And then guess what? If you go and you read the rest of this very famous article he wrote, violence includes almost every conceivable inequity and injustice, all the things we don't like. Poverty, lack of education, denial of basic rights, lack of democracy, certain psychological situations which are complicated. The bottom line, I don't think this is a useful starting point for discussing violence and the kinds of questions that we need to address. Now, let me just say, in fairness, these broad definitions invite us, this is why I think they're appealing to us, to consider the complex causal relationships between and among violence and, let's say, poverty, or the denial of educational opportunities. But that potentially useful element, I think, gets obscured by an overly messy conceptual framework that really doesn't invite us to do the hard work of looking at precisely what's going on. I mean, so poverty, yes, can be related to violence. Maybe it's not always related to violence, or maybe we have to distinguish these things, just to be very simple about it. So in contrast, the Australian political thinker, a guy by the name of John Keane, I think he makes a stronger case for understanding violence as, I quote, unwanted physical interference by groups and or individuals with the bodies of others, which are consequently made to suffer a series of effects ranging from shock, bruises, scratches, swelling, headaches, broken bones, heart attacks, loss of limbs, even death, all of which, of course, may have traumatic psychological effects. Broader definitions, he points out, and I think he's right, obscure what's terrible about violence, how it violates in deeply traumatic ways the body and the psyche. So his point, I'm just impressed by this, and I've been convinced by this. We extend the concept of violence at the risk of trivializing what's terrible about it, what's horrible about it, okay? And I will say there's some really interesting feminist literature that's coming out, nonviolence, which, not surprisingly perhaps, takes that very seriously. I mean, if I had more time, I would talk about that. All right. Now, if we simply left the story there, I don't think we would have made much progress. And I'm sure those of you who are at the workshop feel this way, because some of this I've said versions of already. I apologize. Why not? Well, one reason property damage and violence get conflated is that the former sometimes seems related to the latter. There seems to be a connection. So it's not as though, the Oxford English Dictionary is written by lunatics. I mean, there are reasons why, we've accepted this kind of commonplace view. All right, so this leads me to the second step in the argument. We need a more nuanced account of the relationship between violence and property damage. They're not the same, but sometimes we can identify a nexus between them. So this is where Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm going to bring him into my story. If you go and you read King's speeches about the riots that shook U.S. cities in the 60s, mid-late 60s, he argues, I think correctly, you won't be surprised to hear, that we need to delineate violence against persons from property damage. So he basically says far more eloquently than I have what I've been trying to say. He also begins, and this is helpful now, I think, for us, to suggest how we might distinguish between and among different types of property damage. Now, let me just tell you, if you're looking for this, I wonder if this was translated into Portuguese. This is 1967. And then there's also this book, which is published posthumously. This is actually fascinating because he gave lectures on Canadian public broadcasting, and there's all kinds. He's responding to Black Power. He's talking about Fanon. I mean, a lot of the issues that we are again talking about. I don't know what the discourse here looks like, but in the U.S., this is the part of King we often don't read. We sanitize him, so we read the younger King, the great Christian Gandhi, in which he was, right? And then we read Letter from a Birmingham City Jail. These are much more interesting and messy writings where he's really dealing with, I think, a lot of the issues that we're again dealing with. All right, so if you look at these late writings, he principally is committed to nonviolence in relation to persons. And he's very clear about this. He actually says this in a way that I don't think he had said previously. Now, this isn't the same thing as being an absolutist on nonviolence. We can talk more about this if you want. He called himself a realistic pacifist. And in part, that meant for him that perfect nonviolence was not something that could ever be achieved. And he also knew, basically, in the real political world, one would have to make compromises, right? But yes, nonviolence vis-a-vis persons. I mean, this for him is fundamental, all right? However, nonviolence as it relates to property becomes, and he's very clear about this, for him chiefly a matter of strategy and tactics, okay? Not strict principle. Now, I'm not a King scholar. Maybe this is not a shift in his position, but my sense is that, or at least he's thinking about things in a way that's forcing him to be more clear. Now, what he says in these speeches and essays is really interesting. He says property, because he's talking about the riots and this property damage. Property should preserve and protect sacred human life. He just declares that. Property is an instrument. It's a tool. It's a means towards an end. Only that end, the human person, is sacrosanct. I mean, obviously the argument's religious. He was a religious figure. I think one could reconstruct the argument without religion there if one needed to. By implication, property that directly buttresses or supports human beings should possess, he suggests, a privileged position vis-a-vis property that does so only indirectly or not at all. I don't think he would have been surprised by the fact that we still wince instinctively at politically motivated property damage that seems so closely related to tangible injuries to persons. So again, one example, the destruction of a small shopkeeper's business, and as a result, the loss of her livelihood. Well, usually we are less vexed, bothered by property damage that's unrelated to harm against persons, right? A racist statue is defaced. I mean, we may argue about that, but there isn't the same kind of, I think, moral intuition a lot of us have, that there's something different about this. And he understands that and takes this seriously. So I think he's right to suggest that we can distinguish between and among different types of property damage. This is really the starting point for the rest of my talk. By examining their causal ties or possible causal ties to harm or tangible violations of persons, violence in what I would call the proper sense of the term. Political acts that harm or deface property so as to invite, more or less directly, violations of human beings should be required to pass more demanding tests than those that do not. I mean, this is the intuition. One clear consequence, as King acknowledged, is that when militant protests are subjected to legal sanctions, which they typically will be, even if the protesters hope they will not be, those differences should matter. Some of these acts should be sanctioned less severely than others. The legal system should respond accordingly. Okay? And that, at least in my country, as far as I can tell, so far has not been the case. I mean, you see courts coming down very severely when they're dealing with someone who's pulled down a Confederate statue, or they're dealing in the same way that they deal with someone who has done something which actually potentially risks somebody else's life, right? So building on King, I think we can offer a more differentiated analysis of property damage, or at least we can begin to. That's all I'm doing, beginning to. And you're going to help me finish this because I'm just beginning, and I need your help. So yeah, no, that's true. So unfortunately, the terms we usually employ to talk about these things, again, I have no idea what the Portuguese terms are, so I'd be very curious. So here's what they are in English, and they're so loaded. And until you really think about this, you don't even notice it. So we talk about looting, squatting, and vandalism. So looting, I dug around to look at the origins of this. This is what British colonial power, as it was, of course, exploiting India, exploiting the labor of Indians, when the natives would occasionally engage in some robbery. They're looters. I mean, this is, very biased term. Squatting is not a term we associate with dignity, right? I'll leave it at that. Vandalism, I mean, we sort of implicitly side with the Roman Empire somehow. I mean, does that make sense to you? I'm not sure about this. The Vandals might have done some pretty good things occasionally, right? So these terms, I've made the point, they don't invite impartiality. So what I want to do is move away from them a bit and suggest a typology that, I don't know if it's objective, but maybe is less loaded. So I'm going to talk about symbolic property damage, disruptive property damage, and then last but not least, and this is a broad category and maybe the most problematic one. I'm uncomfortable in some ways, but for now I call it property seizures. So I'm going to say a little bit about each one of them. Let me start with symbolic property damage. So what I want to capture here is a subset of acts where legally unauthorized damage to or destruction of property is directed against some target because of its symbolic or expressive value. Now, this is an image. This is kind of interesting. I think this image went worldwide, right? I mean, that I find fascinating, why some of these things. So everybody has probably seen this already. So this is Bristol 2 years ago, and what happened is anti-racist protesters spray painted and then toppled a statue. His name was, maybe you don't remember his name, Edward Colston. He was a wealthy philanthropist who had a lot of money, and guess where the money came from? The Atlantic slave trade. And he's sort of a local hero, apparently, in Bristol, and then, as you can see, the protesters just tossed him unceremoniously, we would say, into the harbor. And, of course, they were doing so to express support for anti-racism in the aftermath of George Floyd. I should mention his name, George Floyd's murder by police officers in Minneapolis, right? The first image was Minneapolis. By the way, a jury just found them not guilty of all criminal charges, which is really interesting. This is sort of what I'm suggesting I hope people do. Now, I think, strange segue, but U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Holmes, pretty conservative fellow, he was right about some things. I think he was right when he said, it's a very famous quip, he said, we live by symbols. Political symbols, they are vital to us in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's hugely important in my country that now in schools, where you have primarily African-American kids. When I was a kid, you know who they'd look at? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And now it's, wow, when I see it's a very different thing. There's King, maybe Malcolm X. I mean, these symbols mean something. This is important to us, all right? So there's no question that some version of this simple idea, symbols matter to us, provides grounds for valuing and indeed protecting some types of symbolic property, public or otherwise. I mean, this is interesting and also, I think, complicated. But it surely does not preclude politically motivated damage to or destruction of symbolic property, especially, though not exclusively, when activists, I would say, stick close to sort of conventional models of civil disobedience, which is often the case when this happens. So when what they're doing is clearly intended as a communicative act, they're trying to make a point politically, there's no identifiable bodily or psychological violation of anybody. I mean, I don't think the statue here, Mr. Colston, I don't think he felt a lot of pain, right? So he's somewhere else, right? The protesters accept possible legal consequences. These acts, they do fit the sort of standard model of civil disobedience. And what does that matter? Well, why it matters is that in some jurisdictions, they can make that case to a judge and to a jury, and that sometimes matters, not always. There's no law that says, I get to do civil disobedience, right? But this has made a difference. And in fact, some very mainstream liberal thinkers have made precisely this argument. They made it decades ago. A guy by the name of Marshall Cohen, who was a liberal philosopher, who was very influential in John Rawls's famous ideas, liberal ideas about civil disobedience. He did just this. He defended damage to public property as potentially consistent with civil disobedience, even when understood in very strict terms. Okay? If we recognize, and here's the bottom line, that property damage may in fact sometimes be characterized as nonviolent, there's no reason why sometimes at least you just might not call this civil disobedience and then think of it as such. So it's actually less novel than maybe we're suggesting in terms of the politics. Now again, why care? Well, it does matter. I mean, if you're a protester, and you know this if you're an activist, at least in my country, I don't know what it's like in Brazil, if you can make the claim that this is civil disobedience, that actually means something oftentimes, not always. There's no question things get messier when symbolic property damage occurs secretly, when activists avoid legal consequences, in other words, when they really don't follow the standard civil disobedience playbook. Yet even then, these acts may take identifiably nonviolent forms. The fact that the damaged targets are often public property, they're monuments, statues, often means that defacing or destroying them entails no real damage to anybody. I mean, I think this, if you think about it, is pretty straightforward. Even when the activists smear graffiti on a privately owned shop, let's say, the consequences may be onerous, but not life-threatening. So as King, I think, quite correctly suggested, what ultimately should matter in our evaluation of these acts is their impact on persons. Only if there's some clear bodily or psychological violation that comes out of them in a pretty immediate way does it make sense to think of them as somehow not as violent, but I would say implicated in violence. Even when protesters preserve their anonymity or they fail to provide a public justification for what they're doing, its symbolic character often means that they're contributing to public debate. Damages to statues or monuments can be viewed, I think, quite legitimately as a form of counter-speech that targets flawed, hegemonic, anachronistic interpretations of history that are favored by state authorities. Now, I don't know enough about the debate in your country, but in my country, here's a common counter-argument. I think I've heard this is also the argument elsewhere. Here's what people say. Well, we don't want mobs just tearing down these statues. People should follow the ordinary procedures to get rid of these things. Now, here's the problem with this. I didn't know this until I started reading this. There really aren't procedures for this, okay? I mean, it's a bit of a mess. These things are kind of put up, and there's some department that oversees them, and there's not actually a legal mechanism for kind of reviewing them, And the people who've been onto this a lot longer than certainly I have been in my country have been indigenous people who for decades have complained about some of these statues, and it's really quite astounding. They just get this runaround. I went to the mayor's office, and then we went here, and even sympathetic political officials will say, well, we'd love to take it down, but we don't really have the authority to do so. So guess what? People after a while have said, so you can't just say, oh, there's a nonviolent mechanism to there isn't really one, at least as far as I understand. Maybe this is going to change now, right? It's probably not. I mean, the response to some of these protests in the U.S. has been to pass laws which preserve the statues, I'm not making this up, in perpetuity. So you can change the state constitution of South Carolina, but these statues will remain until the end of humanity, basically. I mean, this is just ludicrous, and there's horrible penalties. So, I mean, hopefully that's not going to be the pattern elsewhere. Now, of course, activists can always select the wrong targets. They can fail to impart the desired message. I mean, these could be, skinheads pulling down a statue of, my country, Frederick Douglass. I'm sorry, my examples are American. Their causes can be unjust or stupid. On grounds of political ideology or judgment, we might condemn them, right? I mean, this is true of any kind of political lawbreaking. So my point is not, of course, that all property damage can be justified. Of course not. And clearly, anyone engaging in property damage will have to think hard about potentially counterproductive repercussions. And this, by the way, is a point King hammered away at. I mean, he was very worried, I think rightly, about the sort of backlash that would come out of these acts. He thought they were unwise almost always tactically, which is interesting. Nonetheless, it's just wrong to assert, and we are hearing this, that to assert property damages a priori illegitimacy because of its violent character. I mean, that's not an argument to say this is violent, because I don't think it's violent. All right, the second main type I want to mention today is what I'm going to call disruptive property damage. Now, this subset, I think, raises some more difficult questions. Let me explain why. Illegal acts of this type will often have symbolic significance. So there's overlap with the first category, but they're also trying, and so here's where the difference exists, and here's why I think we need a different category. People are also trying to obstruct practices they think are unjust or illegitimate. And the property that's the target is seen as essential to the disputed practice. So this is what we'll often call sabotage. And I hope I'm not reinventing the wheel, but sabotage has a lot of connotations I think disruptive property damage as a broader category can avoid. We can talk more about this if you want. I mean, there's a lot of things we associate. Sabotage, it was often anarchists who really engage in sabotage, and there are associations because of that which don't always fit what I'm talking about. So this is from South Africa. Although this is often forgotten today, the ANC in South Africa frequently engaged, of course, in disruptive property damage, sabotage. So this is from a famous protest, I think it's outside of Johannesburg, I forget now, where the ANC toppled power lines as a way of making a symbolic statement. It's actually quite brilliant, I think, about the vulnerability of, they were doing this in the context of the apartheid state becoming more and more racist and seemingly more all-powerful. And they wanted to say, you're more vulnerable than you look. And they also, of course, this is why this is disruptive, they wanted to say, we're not going to allow business as usual to go on. We're going to knock out power to these, to the city. Sabotage, I'm sure, as you know, was important to the ANC liberation struggle, though it's still viewed by many today. I mean, there's big debates about it and its ambivalence, in part for the reason that I'm trying to get at. sometimes it wasn't just sabotage of property, even though that's what was intended. It resulted in fatalities. And that, of course, is where it gets very complicated. Some more recent examples would include, let's say, hacktivists who disable computer servers of large firms or state agencies, disrupting practices they consider unjust, somebody like Edward Snowden, right? Much of what's described, I mentioned this already, is ecotage, I think would fall under this rubric as well. Let's stop climate change. Let's do something about it. We're not going to wait for the legislature. It's going to take too long. Let's, and put an end to the climate damage. So here again, I think it's just wrong to characterize these acts as violent. Many, and perhaps most of them, don't generate or seem related to any kind of harm or injury to persons. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I mean, even this, there was a power outage in Johannesburg maybe, but, beyond that. Nonetheless, disruptive property damage can pave the way. Now, this is where it gets messier. Indirect ways to harm against persons. In these more difficult cases, the boundaries between property damage and violence, they begin to blur. Tree spiking by environmental militants, right? So you stick big nails or spikes in trees to keep the loggers from doing their jobs, for example. This poses some pretty direct physical threats to loggers. Though, by the way, I think this is also something one needs to think about, not the owners of the large companies that employ them. It's often, unfortunately, with some of these more militant acts that I would describe as borderline, where you start seeing the specter of physical violence. It's often, in English, we say the small fry, the little guy, little gal. They pay the price, which is also very, even in these battles with police officers. Let's think about this, right? So that's also a complication. I'd say politically motivated arson is always dangerous, since, have you started a fire, right? Fires can rage when it's dry. They can rage out of control, threatening persons and property unrelated to any injustice. That's something interesting about arson. These real dangers suggest that anyone engaging in disruptive property damage should be required, I think, to pass some more demanding tests. Protesters really need to be expected to minimize any possible harms to persons, at least if they want to be committed to nonviolence and also be committed to the principle that we're showing respect to others as equal persons, whenever possible pursuing the least harmful course of action. Their act should always be, I'm now going to quote the Hong Kong-based writer William Smith, constrained, proportionate, and discriminating, such that their intended impacts are concentrated as far as possible on the specific wrongdoing, end of quote. Collateral damage to persons or property unrelated to the protested injustice really needs to be avoided, clearly. Disruptive property damage is arguably also most easily justifiable when it's a last resort and defensive in character, when you're really trying to ward off some manifest harm or extreme injustice. So now I am trying to suggest here are some things people need to be thinking about as they do this. Okay? From this angle, it seems very difficult to justify some recent acts of politically motivated property damage. So, for example, when in Minneapolis and also St. Paul, where the killing of George Floyd took place and things, at least in the U.S., kind of exploded and then they spread, when anti-racist protesters burned down immigrant and family-owned businesses, their acts had devastating consequences for very real people. Some of these acts were assaults on property that directly supported immigrant families and their communities. In my view, they cannot plausibly be justified as part of the battle against racism or racist policing. One would have thought that those fighting racism instead would have made a point of respecting the property of businesses and nonprofits on which racial and ethnic minorities directly depend. Let me just say a little bit about this image. So I lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul for 6 years, and I'll just tell you something so that you can sort of appreciate. We live in such a beautiful, strange world. So the Hmong people were U.S. allies during the Vietnam War. We didn't have too many allies, right? So their immigration to the U.S. was facilitated, and they become a very sizable immigrant group, I think because of a Lutheran church connection in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then also, I think, San Jose, California. One reason this is odd is because Minneapolis has the same weather as Moscow, and these folks come from Southeast Asia, but they have built lives for themselves there. A lot of the immigrant businesses that were really devastated during these riots belonged to these immigrants, many of whom were quite sympathetic also to the protests. They would even have sort of statements, And this has been devastating to some of them. And I mentioned this. My personal angle here is I lived very close to some of these neighborhoods. There was an immigrant-owned restaurant I would frequent, and I was there right before the riots with my daughter, who's going to university there, and just decimated. And this is dumb, right? This is not the way to go. All right, the last piece in my typology, what I'm going to call property seizures. You're going to recognize this picture, right? So I'm the gringo who talks about his country, but I do know a little bit about you. I'm trying to, and I do know learning a lot about this movement, which is fascinating. So what I have here are incidents where property is seized or appropriated for one's use. I think I may be a little ahead of myself, but okay, we'll see that. This is different from disruption that results in property's damage or destruction. All right. So this is what we often call looting or plundering. Now here again, I think it seems, let me go back because this is going to be confusing. One second. I think it's strange to describe these acts as violent. So one example of what I have in mind, the hacktivist Aaron Swartz. Don't know if you've heard of him. He broke into JSTOR, right, which is his electronic collection of journals and scholarly articles, widely used by academics, but very, very expensive for universities to access. It's basically privately owned at this point, to make it available to people who were denied access. And he argued, I think quite powerfully, that obsolescent intellectual property laws were transforming vast troves of knowledge, a lot of which had been gained, he's right about this, by public investment. I mean, a lot of us, I work at public institutions, and, stuff I write is up there, and people now have to pay $49 to download some lousy article, and I got 0 cents. This is a bit of a con, frankly. This is terrible, right? Into protected property. Relentlessly pursued by the FBI because of some laws we have in the US. I won't talk about that. He committed suicide. He was only 26. My point, it's very hard to see how Swartz's acts threaten human life or could be construed as violent. If anything, the state's repressive response is what generated, in his case, tragically, self-harm. What we might also describe as Robin Hoodism, I think, is potentially justifiable, right? So, for example, when the city of Detroit slashed unemployment benefits in 1932, I just came across this example about a year ago, hungry children responded by snatching food from the grocery stores. Their unemployed parents would enter the stores with them and order all the food they can and then just walk out. And what's interesting is the local media had a kind of, they decided not to cover this because they're afraid they'd be copycats. This actually happened all over the United States, and there was a kind of a media blackout because people thought, others might get the idea. During the same period, coal miners in West Virginia, they threatened similar actions to feed their families. A labor union leader announced, this is also what a strange world we live in. This union was very militant, it's now a very conservative union. No state has a right to call you a criminal if you take what you must have to live, unquote, right? The local sheriff managed to get the miners to hold off only by convincing county officials to provide emergency food relief. So what you learn from these examples, I think, is that politically motivated property seizures may, of course, be tragically necessary to prevent avoidable losses of life. Property damage, in other words, can sometimes check or subvert violence. Clearly, that's what Robin Hood was all about. All right, now to this slide. I think a similar claim can be made about what we call squatting. In other words, illegal occupations of land or housing. And of course, this slide is of MST, which really I think is the most prominent, most famous, and maybe best organized movement of landless farmers or peasants on the planet. And very interesting in lots of ways, which you'll have to tell me about, including the fact that they can appeal to your constitution, which is, you're pretty lucky with that. That's not something squatters get to do elsewhere. So this is very interesting. So even though wealthy property owners and state authority, maybe this isn't true in Brazil, but I know this is true in the US, they'll sometimes describe these acts as violence. It's, of course, difficult to see how and why the reuse of typically unused or underused property, especially when the owners are absentee landowners or large, let's say, real estate companies, results in any harm to anybody, really. On the contrary, to the extent that squatting allows for the impoverished or those denied housing to survive and thrive with no tangible harms really to anybody, including the property owners, I'm sorry. I just would like the evidence of that. it arguably prevents harm now in the sense of violence and potential violence to persons. And I do want to point out squatting is very complicated. There are a lot of different forms of it, right? But what I do want to suggest is that this very modest framework that I'm trying to lay out certainly does provide room for this sort of thing, okay? Now, it's true that, and this is, I know, has happened here in Brazil, it's happened a lot of places, squatters sometimes revert to self-defensive violence, right, against state officials. They use violence in the strict sense when they're faced with eviction, but I don't think that sort of violence is essential to the act of squatting itself. So I think we need to just, be clear about this. I mean, whether or not that's a smart thing or not is a different question. All right. Other examples of property seizure, I think, raise some more difficult questions. During the recent anti-racist protests all over the planet, even those of us, and I'm one of them obviously, who sympathize with the protests were alarmed by protesters who stripped the shelves of retail shops owned by immigrants and racial minorities. I mean, at least to me, this was a moment where I thought, wait a minute. So was this critical reaction sensible? Well, I'd say yes. I mean, it's complicated. It's going to depend, it requires political judgment. But in many cases, these businesses directly support human beings who rely on them for their livelihoods. When protesters who have gotten a little out of control, we would say, ransack them, their actions, of course, can have a disastrous impact. Even if stealing from local businesses was never intended to harm anybody, their acts risk becoming part of a complex yet traceable chain of events that generates or might generate economic distress and, yes, it's all too clear, tangible bodily and psychological effects, right? So one can begin to tell what I would call a story about property damage and violence. If a business is wiped out, and this still happens. I mean, the United States is not a very well-developed welfare state. I mean, this can just mean destitution for people. Too often, again, it's the small fry. It's the small businesses, their families, their employees, but not the CEOs or the stockholders in national chains who end up paying the highest price. And I also want to just say, this is another thing that I think is complicated. Some of these, you really have to talk about different forms of property, right? But these independently owned businesses, I do think that's a somewhat different case, let's say, from a Starbucks. Not that that's simple either. A lot of the Starbucks, it's not like Mr. Starbucks. Mr. Schultz runs everything, right? So that's also complicated. But there is a difference, it seems to me, between, let's say, this guy's business or the business I was showing you before. As with disruptive property damage, I think these acts should really, this should be a last resort. When you're faced with severe injustice and you've tried all kinds of things and they haven't worked. The act should be constrained, discriminating, and proportionate. Any tangible threats to human life need to be reduced and ideally eliminated. Other protests, both legal and illegal, including civil disobedience as conventionally practiced, probably should be favored. And there are also reasons I would suggest why protesters involved in these acts need to provide some sort of public defense of their acts. I'm kind of old-fashioned with this. It doesn't mean you have a big statement, but there has to be some way in which, if you're actually trying to reach people, you have to tell people a story about what you're doing. You just can't assume that it's obvious. All right, so the final step. You'll be happy to hear the final step in my argument. Here it is. So what's the problem with this talk? A lot of them, but here's the most obvious one. I've been discussing property damage without any attention to the question of property rights, as though we live in a society where there's no property, no law, right? I've also ignored all of the complicated normative arguments about property, theories of property. Indeed, an implicit presupposition of my argument is what often gets called, at least in the literature on property, an instrumentalist view. In other words, property, the argument has presupposed the idea of property as a means or instrument towards an end, as something that has no intrinsic significance itself. And why did I do this? Because I kind of cheated and said that's what Dr. King believed, and he's a guy we all like, and let's just presuppose this, and we all nodded our heads, right? But let's, and it's not surprising that was his view. He wasn't a Marxist, right, obviously, but he was a democratic socialist, and he had, I'd say, a pretty standard democratic socialist view of property. Yes, there should be private property, but property always has to serve, and there should also be new forms of property. This is the part of King we don't teach school children in the United States, by the way, not surprisingly, right? But that's very much part of King. All right, but what if you don't accept this kind of instrumentalist view? What if you embrace the view of property that attributes a higher moral or normative status to it? What if you see it as unavoidably connected to autonomy, freedom, dignity? I mean, you can pick a lot of different views. You can pick one you want. On some influential accounts, and they're not just libertarian accounts. Okay, there are a lot of libertarian accounts that do this, but also some people here, many of us respect quite a bit. You know, big names, Kant, Hegel, right? Personhood and property are intimately linked. Human beings need private property, according to this classical view, to be autonomous, to exercise moral agency. I mean, I'm simplifying, but this is sort of the spirit of these views. On these views, property is much more than a means or an instrument. It's fundamental to our identity, to who we are. Now, if this is correct, I've wasted your time, I think. I mean, a lot, well, hopefully not totally, but maybe wasted a lot of your time. So how can we respond to this? Well, I want to say, I think, two things. First thing, I think it's important to point out that at least some of the acts I've been describing can arguably be justified on non-instrumental grounds, with a non-instrumental view of property. I mean, this is why I think squatting is so interesting. I mean, it usually involves people laboring, mixing their labor with material objects to use and possess them, And frankly, that kind of thing can, I think, easily be justified. A lot of people have said this with recourse to quite traditional notions of property. I mean, you could come up, and people have done this with a kind of Lockean, John Locke defense of land squatting or occupation, right? You own something because you mix your labor with it, and you leave enough, you use it, and you leave enough for others to go around, and that's okay. So here, there's a property justification. And this is also, I mean, one of the, the squatters I first encountered as a student in the 80s in Hamburg, Germany. I always found this quite interesting because, very militant people, often anarchists, and when you actually went into the properties they squatted, be careful where you step, don't use that room, and they're like homeowners, sort of like very protective and like, oh, we're working on this over here. I mean, it's very interesting, and that's kind of this, the element of, yes, they actually become in a strange way. They're not private, this wasn't private property, but they're thinking like property owners in a way, right? So you see this. All right, nonetheless, so that's one response, that some of this stuff, I think, you could defend it with this other view or other views of property. Nonetheless, I do think it remains the case that non-instrumentalist views of property challenge many of the examples I've been talking about. So even when property damage cannot be plausibly linked to tangible harms to persons, on the non-instrumentalist view, there are a lot of different versions of it, but I'm, again, generalizing, there still might be sound reasons for acknowledging, let's say, the sanctity of property. So in this non-instrumentalist view, damaging or stealing from a privately owned business, let's say, would have to be interpreted, and I think many people would interpret it, as an attack on the individual owner's autonomy or dignity. Even otherwise seemingly minor acts of property damage, right, smashing a store window, let's say, might be plausibly viewed as a form of harm and or violation of basic rights fundamental to the person. I mean, this is the traditional view. In other words, the distinctions that I have tried to draw between violence against persons and property damage. So I tried to say there's a clear distinction, and then things are blurry, but this distinction itself on this non-instrumentalist view would just vanish altogether. So that still really is a challenge for this argument. So let me just try to respond very briefly with what I hope pushes back a little bit against it. As Jeremy Waldron, he's a legal philosopher originally from New Zealand, has pointed out, I think quite accurately, and he has a big book on property where he makes this claim. The idea that, I quote, property owning is necessary for the individual's ethical development. So this is how he describes these non-instrumental views. He's talking about a lot of different views. What's often forgotten is that these views imply that property ownership should be universal. I mean, and so what he does, I think it's very clever. He takes these theories, people on the left might view as conservative, and says, actually, this is really a demand for a kind of universal system of ownership, right? Everybody, if property is so important to who we are, everybody should have it. So non-instrumentalist views provide, again, his words, no justification, he says, for a society in which some people have lots of property and many have next to none. nor do they mesh well with the widespread indifference in my society and your society towards the dire material strait of many impoverished people. So in short, these non-instrumentalist views demand, this may surprise you, he thinks, and I think this is right, a relatively egalitarian distribution of economic, not perfect equality, but much more egalitarian distribution than we have, right? And for a very simple reason. If property is morally and politically so fundamental, everybody, for crying out loud, should have it. And unless you think there's sort of a fundamental inequality between persons. But that's not the argument these theorists would make. But that, of course, he also says this, and he's right, that's not the world we find ourselves in. Right? We're not living in the world of universal property ownership, although sometimes we maybe believe that. Our world, versus that described by some of these philosophers who are developing these non-instrumentalist theories, is plagued, I don't think this is a big insight, by massive material inequalities and injustices. The real world, in other words, doesn't look at all like the world that's presupposed by these non-instrumentalist theories. Final point. By implication, there still may be good reasons, thus, to allow for some cases of constrained, politically motivated property damage. Why? Well, sure, under ideal material conditions, property might indeed deserve a more privileged status. If we lived in a world that looked like these ideal property theories, okay. But those conditions have not been achieved in our terribly unequal societies. Given the harsh empirical realities of existing property ownership, it seems to me it makes sense to continue to prioritize human persons vis-a-vis property, and thus demand of political and legal officials, including, let's say, prosecutors, judges, and the whole bit, that they treat some types of politically motivated property damage as long as they meet some of the criteria I have cautiously tried to lay out with a measure of leniency. I mean, this is sort of I'm hoping that some judge think about this. I don't know if probably no judges here, unfortunately. That's how these things work. But I really do think this should matter. My argument, yes, it should matter when these protesters get sanctioned. I mean, these things should make a difference. Now, again, as Dr. King would remind us, damage to or destruction of property can generate counterproductive political backlash. And I have to say, I think what happened in 2020, I have mixed feelings. I'm not sure about it. I think, like what you saw on the first slide, this became, the right wing loved this. And you can see, this is, here they come. They're going to get you next. Put the lock on the door, right? This is, there are strategic and tactical reasons that I think do militate against this. These kinds of protests, they can be done, again, for dumb reasons. I mean, there's a lot of dumb political action history. These are the cases of civil disobedience we never read about because they were so dumb, maybe, right? We read about the iconic cases. We don't read about the failed ones. However, under circumstances of injustice and inequity, I do think property damage in principle is normatively justifiable and sometimes politically appropriate. A fundamentally decent legal system, in contrast to the not very decent ones in which we probably find ourselves, should respond accordingly. Okay? So I thank you for your patience, and my goodness, I've been talking a lot longer than I was told to talk for, and I'm looking forward to your criticisms and comments. This really is a first stab at some of these questions, so thanks.
Well, thank you, Bill, for your lecture. For us, it's really important to have you here. It's been very fascinating days here with you, with discussions that were directly linked to your talk, but some of them that were not. But we are. I think that this is a core thematic for us here as well, not only for the U.S. We have a statue that was very famous also during a specific protest. It's called Borba Gato. I don't know if you know.
Tell me,
He was a bandeirante. It was one of the guys who were sent into the deepest rural areas, but also deep in the cities in order to catch people, in order to enslave them.
Okay, yeah.
So, and this statue was burned down. And this whole big discussion on the how this repercuted in Brazil. It was really the image was very evocative of some things like that, but especially of the symbol, and there was a really big discussion in public sphere, but also in court. So we have definitely some very similar parallels. And we have a very deep and long tradition of squatting that's so interesting, right? So
impressive tradition.
I'll get there, but well, my job here is to put some comments into your text, and this is also great because it's completely integrated my research agenda. I have been looking at protest and property, but especially at squatting, housing rights, right to the city for quite a bit. But I will start with your specific proposal and kind of comments for us to think together and for you to react to and to talk a little bit more. So I think it's really good that you put the distinction between people and property is very classic. You state that and you say, well, maybe when we are trying to justify damage to property, we have to make several other distinctions. And I think they're very useful because we can then start to understand the consequences and how this could be treated both normatively, but also in a very strict legal sense. And then one thing that I think is important, Martin Luther King is central to your argument. You said here, I cheated, I went directly to Martin Luther King because who is going to be against Martin Luther King? And we're now using his. You're going to speak against, at least you have to look at it. Exactly. He's watching. Exactly. So it's like even if he's using the term sacred livelihood, we can then take the argument and make it not religious, which I believe is right. But I'm asking myself if it does really, in which extent does it help us? When we are talking about the small business owners, immigrants, it's clear that's for their livelihoods. But when you started to talk about Starbucks, it started to get a little bit difficult. And because the thing here is about the human needs and the direct human needs. And maybe people are going to see human needs differently, or in what extent does, in this utilitarian kind of way, it has to serve. I mean, how are we able to draw the line? Maybe you're probably going to say, I can't. We'll have to see case by case, and maybe this is more blurred. But in what way does this definition, this specific utilitarian definition, leads us in order for a criteria that we have to negotiate from time to time? And maybe people are going to say, well, not only symbols matter, as you say, but this is a specific vital necessity for me. I don't know how. I like the idea, but. Right. No, are we not putting it into another, transferring the problem to another realm, which I don't think it's bad in itself or bad at all, but how do we cope with that if we want to use Martin Luther King? And I'm trying to embrace it. So another thing that I think is important here in squatting, but also in every political property damage, we would recur to something that we call the social function of property. And it's not only a normative idea. What's that? Can you translate that into American? I keep thinking what is that? My God, that sounds like social function. I'm teasing you. Yeah. Keep going. Just. I don't know. You happen to know a little bit about Weimar. Come on, that's the origin. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. No problem. That's the origin. So the social function of property that in Brazilian constitution and not Weimar right now. Yeah. It has. It is obviously a blank term. Like we fill it with with content. But in the Brazilian Constitution, it's not that vague. Like, if you're talking about urban property, you have to see the city's master plan. And there should be the criteria, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is called Centrão, that in 1987 decided to put another venue in another law in order for us not to fulfill social function of property for 20 years. But in rural property, we have some pretty straightforward definitions, like you should not have slave labor in your property. You should not do environmental damage. You should not, and that's also, Marina was reminding me of that, that's also controversial, should not plant drugs or psychotropics. So there's some straightforward criteria, and we are battling over them, and they are understood as legal. So when housing movements or landless movements are occupying empty buildings or empty property, they are using that, and they are saying, we are not practicing civil disobedience. We are actually fulfilling the law, right? So I understand that the U.S. Constitution does not have such a statement, and this is probably difficult to make the case. But here in Brazil, it's maybe easier. I don't know. Not that it's easy at all, right? Don't get me wrong. But that it has a legal anchor. Something that I would say that I think it's kind of maybe a weak part of the argument is the part that the objects do not feel pain. Why? Because it is obvious, I agree with that. But if you take Jeremy Waldron in this very big book on property, he's going to state a very important thing that's also important for law in general, but I think for political theory, that the relationship of ownership or of property, it's not between people and things, but between people. Exactly. So he was going to say, it doesn't matter to me that the object doesn't feel pain, because the relation is not to the object. The relation is to other people. So when you are excluding other people, when you are, maybe this, we should. You're saying this is a collective project. I already understood it. So maybe we should have to not change, but amend this argument in order for not to be so easy for Aldrin to say, well, that doesn't matter to me.
Okay. No, keep going.
And another comment I would say is that, because you're saying about Brazil, is that squatting, but I think that all damage to property is understood by organized social movements as a dispute on public justification. So when you see MST, the landless movements, or the housing movements, they're going to occupy, and we also have different, not invade, occupy, right? You have to occupy a specific piece of land that has several tax debts, that has been abandoned for 30 years, that you can construct a narrative in order for you to justify publicly and not necessarily on courts. But publicly, you have to make it legitimate for everyone to see, well, it makes sense for a group to occupy. And I think it's quite what you're saying. Like, you have to tell people, when you're saying that was dumb, you have to tell people why this is legitimate. But I think, at least here in Brazil, I don't know how this happens in the US, maybe it's different, but there is a very specific difference that when this is translated into legal reasoning. Not always those things are immediately connected. Of course, it's very important for a public sphere to understand it as legitimate. There are not separate spheres. But I think that there are maybe different levels of the argument. So I would also comment that. I would have several other comments, but I already talked too much, so I'll stop here. And then Marcos has also some comments, and then we will open for everyone to ask Bill questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions.
Can I go directly?
Yeah, I may end up forgetting things. So should I answer? Or?
Bill, why don't we do that? As you wish.
You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Obrigado. So, Bill, thanks a lot, not only for accepting to come, but for accepting the several activities we proposed to you. So you were here all the time, so people at SEBRAP, they already say, "Hi, Bill, how are you doing?" Okay, I won't talk about the other.
Goodbye, Bill.
No, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. So I won't mention our previous discussion about the notion of life, just to say that we were discussing about the notion of life.
And I should try to respond.
Okay, that's no problem. I'll move on. So I want to focus on another aspect. I think it relates to Bianca's questions, because it's also related to criteria and also related to public justification. So I think that your paper, correct me if I'm wrong, draws heavily on political obligation.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's all over. It's not explained, but it's there.
That's
and
the background.
we know that a political obligation has kind of 3 or 4 libraries of books written on political obligation. I think I understand your intent, which often is to turn things upside down from inside. Mm-hmm. So that's Bill Scheuerman. To engage with roles, to turn roles upside down and Rawlsians and everything. When we look at this literature, I think it's okay. It's a vast literature. It's diverse, etc. But it has a common point, and this common point is: let's not talk about social contract agreements. Let's talk about consent. And it's essential for such a literature to make the link between consent and legitimacy. So, which is your point? Yeah. Because I was struck that you use the literature, or at least the framework of political obligation, but consent doesn't appear in your paper. And on the other side, legitimacy is all over. So we have political obligation and legitimacy all over. But we don't have consent. I always think about John Plamenat when he makes a critique of Locke, because he says if you began by assuming that only consent creates a duty of obedience in this case, you are only too ready to conclude that whatever creates that duty must be consent. So that's the argument. But it's there in your text. Political obligation, duty.
Yeah.
That's
interesting.
Yeah. So I was disturbed that you framed your question in those terms.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you don't need to, but then I was so curious. Of course, I can't ask you what makes an obligation or what creates obligation. That wouldn't be fair. But I think it's fair to ask you why did you choose to frame your question in those terms?
Yeah.
So that would be
That's
it.
great. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I take the microphone?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just go backwards because that's Marcus. These are fantastic questions. I think both of you really, and I don't have good answers. So Marcus, I just have. I think you identified something really crucial. So a lot of this debate about disobedience, resistance, it's part of a broader debate. Not everybody may know this on political obligation. And a lot of that, you're right, historically involves some version, some notion of consent, sometimes a social contract. that part of it, I think, has kind of fallen out of the debate. I mean, it's actually just interesting. I'm just thinking about this, and it should be. I should have thought about it because I've been working on this stuff for a while. And no, it's that, so you do have people who are old-fashioned contractualists and consent theorists. Mostly the philosophical, they call themselves philosophical anarchists. They're basically libertarians, all right? Guy named John Simmons, who says things like, who's a very strict Lockean, who takes Locke very literally and says, we actually don't have consent in the way Locke says, and therefore we don't have to have an obligation to obey the law. And therefore we should have a sort of instrumental, if we think murder is a bad thing, basically, we shouldn't, it should be illegal. But a lot of the traditional notions we have about requiring us to obey no longer obtain because there never was this kind of ideal consent theory. But otherwise, so a lot of the people I'm responding to, the people I'd say on the left who were trying to broaden these notions, they've kind of dropped the consent thing. And I don't talk about consent. And I also would not, so where I think you're absolutely right is what I didn't do in the presentation, don't do in the papers. I need a story, an argument about legitimacy. And I don't think I would want one really. Maybe there could be a Habermasian one. Maybe that would be the way to go with hypothetical consent and so on. I'm not so comfortable with that. No, I know, and I think we'd agree about that. But I think your point is really, really important because you're identifying, not just for me, but I think in this issue, this weird thing that's happened where the debate began with debates about consent and it's kind of gotten dropped. And nonetheless, we use this language, and we talk about legitimacy,
You have Peter Singer who talks about quasi-consent.
Yeah, that's right.
This is the limit of the thing.
Yeah. So maybe I'm just going to very vaguely defend what I'm doing. Maybe one can do the sort of thing I'm doing without buying into this older kind of framework, and maybe I just need. What I would need is a story about legitimacy. And I think I am, that also was not in the presentation, but I think that might be interesting to talk about. I think I am presupposing for my argument a more or less legitimate society, So in other words, we talked about this at the workshop. I do think there are extreme circumstances where you live in a terrible dictatorship where I don't think there are any moral, political, legal restraints in terms of I do think then violence, organized violence, maybe can be justified and may be necessary. Then it becomes a strategic question: is this the right way to go? Okay, so a lot of this argument does presuppose some society where there are functioning publics, more or less, and even groups that are disadvantaged and oppressed can make their they can make their case to the public, or they can go to a court. So there is a story there, both, speaking as a political theorist, a kind of normative account of legitimacy, and then kind of empirical claim. But you're right, that is not,
Rawls is smiling there.
Oh, yeah, okay, all right, yeah.
Looking at you.
Oh, really? Oh, that's, okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right, okay,
Yeah, John Rawls is there.
John Rawls, okay, back there, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So the other question you asked, can I ask you your previous? Other question Marcus asked, and I really have struggled with this the last couple of months. So Marcus had a somewhat earlier version. It was similar in some ways, where you said, if I remember, look, the King argument really focuses on life, existence, and kind of self-preservation. That becomes sort of the standard, So sure, you can tear down a statue, nobody's life's threatened. But this is a kind of limited view of who we are. And I've decided you're right about that. And so that's why I was trying to say, yes, we are. This is maybe just a lawyerly way of dealing with the fundamental concern. But, well, I want to say something to you. No, I do this idea that we do need symbols, that there's, of course, more to us than we need to eat, Because it's true if you don't, and there's a place for symbols. But I still don't, and then where it gets complicated is, I didn't say this in the talk, but I'll say this now. I also think, tearing down, so let me put it this way. So, if it's not a very difficult example, I'm sure these things are happening, or they have happened, right? White supremacists and go and tear down a good statue, right?
we had it here in Brazil. There were two Bolsonaristas who teared Marielle Franco's street name in two. So
yeah, we have this in the U.S. too, obviously, right? So, I mean, clearly. I mean, I would not want to see that as violence. I would want to say it's possible that we can talk about a nexus with violence. So let's say this, I mean, I'm just making up an example. Maybe there are examples like this. If we're talking about a neighborhood in my country, African-American kids, and this is happening systematically, anytime they attempt to put up a Frederick Douglass statue, white thugs come in. I mean, you could talk about some pretty serious psychological repercussions. So then you might, so anyhow, I do want to move away from this being just a kind of, when you didn't put it this way, you were much more subtle, but it was kind of you were accusing me of the Bertolt Brecht, erst das Fressen, dann die Moral, right? First you get the food, and so we're really worried about eating and surviving, and not all the other stuff that we also need. So I don't want to go there, although I do think, this is where maybe I'm just very confused about this. I do like the way in which King is saying, look, there are some things very clearly we're talking about people's existence, in terms of surviving versus things that are not. And, and he said this, and that sounds very abstract, but he says, look, when you start, one of the things that happened in the late 60s in the US is you have looting of color TVs, because that was a symbol of middle class life. I just mentioned, I was a little kid not too far from somewhere these riots happened, and years afterwards, I can tell you this, we should know this, in this white, lower middle class neighborhood, old people would say, watch out for that color TV set. Seriously, it was like they had not forgotten this, right? In that way, it had a really negative kind of political consequence, because these are people who ended up, many of them had been Democrats, voted for the right? I know, it's right. I remember being a kid, so what are you talking about, But King, he correctly says, look, stealing this is not the same thing as when the National Guard is shooting black protesters. Please, these are just very different things. And it's also even more interesting because in some of these riots in the U.S., King claimed this, and I didn't know this is true, but actually the evidence suggests it was true. People would call up, the parents sometimes, the people who'd done this, said, we're bringing this stuff back in. We don't want to keep it, So it was more, he actually says, this was sort of a symbolic appropriation of middle class life. And, it's not even really property damage. It's a very subtle discussion of this. Okay, so to that, Bianca's questions, a whole bunch of good questions here. So, you're absolutely right. Property is fundamentally a social relationship. Okay, and I don't say this. I do think my account, I can see why one might take me as suggesting the older view. It's me and my thing. No. But I do think the social relationships where we're talking about the destruction of a thing versus those where we're talking about the destruction of people, that's how you'd have to make the distinction. I'd also, since this is your field of expertise and I can give you a hard time, it's also true that because I've been reading all this stuff on property theory, some of which is really dry, but and this is what you, right? But some of those people are moving back, right, towards introducing thinghood. There has to be, when you think of property, there has to be some place for the thing. Because it's not just you exclude other people from control over something, but it may be a virtual thing, right? So no, you're absolutely right about that. Social function of property. You're right. We don't have that in the U.S. Constitution, right? But I will say, U.S. property law does also include, in some levels, very, very similar things. So one of the things squatters can appeal to in the U.S. is we have laws in many cities about, as a way of basically pushing back against unused land to keep land, property owners from just kind of leaving it there. So squatters do appeal oftentimes quite effectively, and with the support, depending on the city, of city government. So there's also legal stuff, right, fortunately, that people can appeal to. Not in all of these cases, clearly not, But yes, there's some room there. So I would say, I think there's a little, maybe we disagree or maybe a misunderstanding about civil disobedience. So I think it's what you're describing, you're saying in Brazil, people can appeal to the Constitution. This is sort of a legal claim. I actually think, I was saying this the other day when we were chatting, this is very common in civil disobedience. So even in the civil rights movement, King is saying, this is really important. The Supreme Court has pushed back against segregation in schools, and it's white segregationists and their supporters in state governments who are violating, which was basically right, federal law, keeping the schools segregated. We're standing in for the law. So you might say, why call this civil disobedience? Well, the reason for this is to protest these actions. They would engage in some act which state authorities at least would say is illegal. And they would often say, they did, like you trespass or you protest when you're not allowed. But I think it's actually quite common to have this kind of complicated situation with the law, where people who are protesting are appealing to the law. And this is also sort of an old-fashioned argument, but I do think that it sounds like that has been very effective in Brazil. I think there's a tendency now for movements, and I think that's actually really interesting, to kind of renounce that kind of legal discourse as counterproductive, versus, I would say it's limited. There's only certain, social movements are not lawyers. We don't want them to be lawyers, right? But there should be some sort of constructive relation to the law. And one of the things that has worried me a little bit is that people we're no longer doing that. I have a story about this. I'll just give you the quick version. I'll tell the American story. There's much less faith in the capacity of the state and law to do anything. And this has led on the right to a kind of right-wing anti-statism, I think on the left, to what I would call a kind of, be careful, there are real smart, reflective, thoughtful anarchists, but there are also people who are just anti-statist on the left and anti-law without thinking about it. I think that's a mistake, It's true we could not recapture this moment when people like King, he had faith. This is actually astounding in some ways to younger activists that, you could mobilize publics and change policy. A lot of people no longer have that faith, and I understand why. But if you abandon that legal terrain, I think that's a mistake. Because and King got this. He thought this was how we, let's tell middle class, white Americans, we're the ones standing up for this damn Constitution. And that did convince some people, That's a powerful way to argue. So I do think that's always part of, and I think some of these activists, it's interesting, some of them have done that, some have not, Maybe it's difficult with some of the cases. Yeah, last thing you said, how I may be making things too easy for myself. No, I think you're right. No, you're right. Even Starbucks, someone could say there's some, I work at Starbucks and you took my job away, right? And you're right. So this is why the last and the crudest, least developed part of my presentation maybe is the most important, unfortunately for me, because I think you need more of a story about the forms of property, right? So the easy answer to the Starbucks one is to say that's a very different type of property from an independently owned store, okay? You're talking about a large corporation, and stockholders and so on, very different. So I think that has to be fleshed out. Some of the people I'm arguing against, I didn't talk about that in the presentation, but it's in the written version. They don't often make those distinctions. So there's a book that defends looting, which I read because it's very provocative. But looting is okay because I'm not exaggerating. Any kind of looting is an attack on white racialized capitalism. And I know you're right. And when and the author even says this even applies when people are going after immigrant shopkeepers, And this, I'm sorry, I don't ask the poor Korean guy if he, you're white racialized cap. What are you talking about? This does not make sense. We have to make distinctions, And it's also, we don't want to. We got to be hard-headed about this. Some of these incidents also, I didn't mention this, King also has to deal with this. A lot of the businesses that were looted in these cities in the late 60s were often Jewish businesses. So black activists were accused of anti-Semitism, and that's also really, he basically says, I don't think it's anti-Semitism, but I do think, and this empirically turns out to have been true, a lot of the businesses that operated in these minority neighborhoods often charged ridiculous prices because they could get away with doing this, And, but yeah, even now some people would say King maybe there was something else going on there. And I do think, unfortunately, maybe, I didn't want to talk about that with Minneapolis, but there are tensions between these different communities, of course. So that's another thing, nothing to do with property ownership, but that also complicates the story. But you're right, one has to tell a more complicated story about this. I still would say, let me put it this way, it's an empirical claim. If I work at a Starbucks, the Starbucks is smashed up, I lose my job, I don't think that, is that as much of an existential threat under conditions? You'd have to look at who the employers are. Mm-hmm. Are they students and they can get another job? This is where these are.
Maybe there is something like of a direct link in the part of the small business stores, and a more complex or non-direct, or maybe non-causality, because in the first one you're claiming a causality.
Right. I'm claiming possible causality.
Exactly. In the others, you have a lot of several ways to go that do not have to be a cause, right? Maybe this distinction is helpful. I don't know.
That I like.
And one thing which is also interesting, I don't know if you know, but in Chile, there was something that's called estallido social. It was a very social riot in 2019 with a lot of damage to people and to property.
Yeah.
But my favorite president, Gabriel Boric, has.
Is he really? Yeah.
My favorite president.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. No, good for you. I'm just. This is being taped, If he does something really stupid, you're going to regret this.
Yeah. Right now, I just made my life hard.
Yeah.
But they made a package of repair, like a repair for the estallido social that included the people who have been shot and have been blinded, for instance.
Okay.
But also the small stores.
Yeah, interesting.
That have been damaged or that have lost and the workers.
Okay.
So they're expanding the category of reparation for the protest in order to include those two. I don't know if this is common in the U.S. But I thought it was very strategically thoughtful.
Right.
So.
Yeah, they're a bailout. You apply for emergency funds, which, by the way, which is common practice, and guess who tried to keep that from happening to these cities? I won't say the name. The man will not be mentioned. That I don't mean Voldemort. No, Trump, right? No, and there was a battle about that. I don't know though if it. I just don't know. I don't think they actually do that in that kind of way. So it's like whoever can sort of make a case, and so you do have to have the capacity to kind of lay out. That's a problem for a lot of small businesses. You have a couple doing it, and the paperwork is like this. Yeah, interesting. Okay. No, there's a very helpful things in terms of me to try to think more through, and you have to send me your written comments. Both of you guys, great if you do that. So.
Should we now open for comments and questions?
People are impatient.
Thanks, Boo, again. It reminded me a lot of our talk Tuesday. No, it was nice actually, because it was like from a different perspective. Like the papers are not the same, so we got to read different things as well. So thank you. I was actually reminding a question Bianca posed on Tuesday. So the difference between damage and violence. Yeah, and and you said, okay, so let's wait for Thursday, and so so it's, so I was thinking about this question, and also about this typology you made. So symbolic and disruptive, and the third one is property. Seizure. So in the case of seizure, I was thinking.
Keep going. Sorry.
No. Please do. Please just interrupt me when you feel like. But I was thinking, in the case of seizure, is damage a proper concept for that? So because in this case, I think we're talking about not a damage to the property itself, so like the land, the object, like the fact, but to the right of property. And so the person who gets this land has not it anymore, like the fact. so the possession of the land. So I don't know. I'm thinking about that. I'm a bad lawyer, but I learned a bit of civil Deutsches Recht. So I was thinking that because there they have this separation like from the fact and the right when you buy and sell stuff. So the thing is goes first, but the right goes afterwards. So are you talking about the fact or the right of property? So property as a fact or as a right?
Yeah.
So and that's my thing with damage. Is it broad enough to encompass this seizure? And the second question is actually more basic and has to do with what Marco said. So in the beginning of your lecture and the beginning of your paper, you said you were trying to make a case so that property damage should not be confused with uncivil disobedience. So at the end, so now that you made your point, is it or is it not a matter of obedience? So I don't know.
What do you mean is it a matter of obedience?
Obedience to authorities, I don't know. So where, how to frame it like concretely as a because you said it was something different from uncivil, but also civil disobedience, as I could get, because it was not something like necessarily related to violence. But how to say it? So, and I'm thinking this not just to legitimize it as in public sphere, but also in court. So how should we bring these issues there? So if it's not something about like respecting law or I don't know, obeying to some authority, what's it like? I don't know, it's basic, sorry, maybe I'm not getting
No, it's not basic.
correctly, but that's it, thank you.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
Now, the black block.
The black block.
I was wondering if there isn't an unresolved normativity issue, because, in terms of justifying damage or violence to property, if you took a non-instrumentalist theory of property, maybe Kant not, but Hegel and Husserl, for example, I think Neumann does this distinction, right, between labor-based theories of properties and possession-based. So I think you would have no problem justifying that. But when you start from from an instrumentalist theory of property, you kind of dislocate this normativity question to another. I mean, it's not the justification of the property that can be used to legitimize your damage, because the justification in instrumentalist terms would point to something else, right?
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think that's a good clue to that is that and it would point to something else. And as you talk about violence, I'm not sure that what it seems that your argument is that if you say that it's not violent, you will already have done the justification work for the damage to property. And the thing is, suffering or violence is not normative, right? I mean, there is instinctively, I don't know how to say that word. Yes. Yeah, you get something that of course there is something that is normative, kind of reflex there to violence, but violence in itself is not normative, right? So I'm not. Okay. I'm trying to think how you could justify, or what are you appealing to? Is it like a robust anthropological conception, or what does the normative work there? Okay. And I think that's important because the actors, they are not justifying their property damage in those terms. They are not saying it's not violence, therefore it's legitimate. They're saying this is not violence, maybe. But then they start the justification work. So I'm not.
Okay.
Maybe you confuse it. It's the presentation.
Thanks. So I will take these in reverse order. These are great questions, clearly. So, Marina, I think you're right that that's also why I just came up in part with this third category, property seizure, because it also occurred to me this isn't always damage or destruction. So maybe, I mean, in some ways, I have a dumb answer. I didn't want the title of the presentation to be, can there be property damage and also this weird thing we call seizure? I mean, there'd be 6 people here then, right? I mean, so these are all politically motivated violations of property, right? I mean, really, that would be the right way, I think, of thinking about it. I do think the property owners in these cases that I'm talking about, they do see it as damage. You know, you go into someone's store and you say, I'm taking all your stuff. They would say, excuse me, yes, this, right? So, but in the sense, so this also speaks to the question we were talking about. Should we see property as a social relationship? What's the place of the thing or of the object or whatever, right? That gets complicated. So basically, I think you're right. It's too easy to see that as damage or destruction. Certainly in the case of squatting, it doesn't make any sense, it seems to me. But, you know, from a kind of, well, not common sense, but just, I also do think there are people who view it that way, and I'm just in a very naive way for the purpose of this paper taking that seriously. You know, not just the shopkeepers, a lot of other people would say, what, people go into a store and they walk out with the stuff? That's damage, right? They're taking something from someone else and they're consuming it too. You know, the guy doesn't get to, the gal doesn't get to sell it. But you're right, there's more that has to go on there, so I have to figure that out.
May I just give one example? Sorry to interrupt you, but there are some cases from the homeless movement or from the landless movement in Brazil in which the occupations that happened into empty buildings or landlords, they were in court said to be a destruction of the fence, of the lock, of the door.
Oh, wow.
So, that's why they said it was illegal in its such because you're destructing something in order to break in. But this is not. This is actually sophisticated because how are you going to deny that you broke the lock, right? So in those cases, they're seen as destruction. So maybe this is, I don't know if a way to go, but just for you to know that this also happens here in Brazil.
Okay. No, I mean it's I also I like this, but I also might want to think about other. Do you think? I mean, I'll just throw this out. If people think that there are forms of politically motivated property violation, just using that I've missed, that I would be curious about. I really wanted to come up with something that sort of captured the differences. That would be really that's a very selfish question for me because I'm sort of struggling reading a lot of stuff, like reading about the landless peasants in your country. That I just found absolutely fascinating. That movement. That would be just a question I have for people. So you were asking about civil disobedience, uncivil disobedience, property damage, and where does it kind of fit in, right, if I understood? So that's maybe a little hard to explain without knowing a bit about this debate, which Marcus was talking about. So there are now people, Candace Delmas, and there are a lot of people who are now bought into this, who say we have something very new, it's uncivil disobedience. And this model of uncivil disobedience, she basically kind of turns a certain view of civil disobedience on its head, right? So it's civil disobedience is public, so this is now secret, not about respect for the law, people don't care about the law, and so on. And she will describe property damage as falling under this rubric, okay? So in part, I want to say, yes, that is correct. There is a lot of property damage taking part, or property violation taking part in these political protests, and this does seem to be increasing. However, and I did say something, I realized that probably was confusing. Sometimes if we understand violence and nonviolence properly, no, this is just really civil disobedience, okay? And you might say, well, that's definitional. Who cares? Well, it matters. You know, if I go to a court and say, resistance, uncivil disobedience, I forget about it. If I go and say, I read Martin Luther King, and this is actually, progress, and we're doing civil disobedience, and here's why, you might, depending on context, you might get a bit of a break. Maybe not. You may get no break, but you might, right? So I do think there are quite a number of these cases actually really are civil disobedience as long as you don't understand nonviolence as strictly precluding all forms of property damage, which I think is a mistake. Why do I think it's a mistake? As I was telling you, not even Martin Luther King believed that. And even I mentioned Marshall Cohen, who is, really impressive liberal theorist, but not very radical. Even he's saying this in 1970, I think it is. And during the protests against the Vietnam War in the U.S., students would go in and burn records. They would burn public documents. They also, destroying war statues and things. And and they would call that civil disobedience. And I actually think that's right sometimes. So even though we may think uncivil disobedience sounds very radical, it is capturing things that civil doesn't capture. I just think politically, one should be very careful about this. Now, it is true that some forms of property damage may not be civil disobedience. If you go secretly and destroy a shop or destroy a Starbucks, I don't know, and then a week later, a statement: we are the anti-monopoly capitalist coffee coalition. Watch out. I mean, that's probably not civil disobedience for reasons hey, and also you're anarchists and you're like, forget about the law. So that's not civil disobedience, and that would be, I'd say, uncivil disobedience. So it really doesn't fit into. So one of the things I want to do, that's the somewhat boring academic thing, is I want to say this category, uncivil disobedience, has to be disaggregated, people talking about it. So I think this book is really good by Candace Delmas. You should read it. It's getting a lot of attention. It should be getting attention. But I think she needs to disaggregate. We need to look at these different things that go on. She kind of does that in the book, but then because she wants to say this is the way to go on civil disobedience, she just stops doing it. Okay, Gabrielle, these are some really difficult, fundamental questions. So, so here's how I would, as you say, unresolved normativity. There's a claim about violence as a social phenomenon. It's not normative, right, necessarily. And where does the normativity come in? And instrument. So I think you were right. In this paper, I'm arguing at these different levels in a way which may be, it's not as clear as it could be, right? So one thing I just wanted to do is say, here's how to understand violence. This is, in my view, the best way to understand it. It's not uncontested. Now that is normative, and certainly in the political world, it's not just that people say, oh, that's a violent act. They say, or they're thinking, I know that violent acts get punished in my legal system, and they should get punished. So they're also thinking in terms of, here's what violence is, and then there's a normative claim. So I do a little bit of that in the paper, and you're right, I think there are these different kind of levels, So even though a lot of the polemical point is to say we need a more nuanced, I think we need a more useful way to think about violence that allows us to think more constructively about some of these difficult cases. It's very clear to me that means something normatively, it means something legally, even though I didn't really lay that out, maybe, right? Now, I don't think, one thing you said, maybe I misunderstood, these instrumental views, they also, just maybe we're talking by each other, they're very different ones, clearly, a lot of them. And they also are all about normative arguments. So King's view, which I mentioned, it's kind of a Christian view, I'd say a Christian socialist view. He really was, So human beings are sacred. Property is put here for us to use, and therefore, destruction of property doesn't have the same status, destruction of the person, because property is not made in the image of God. That's one instrumental view, but there can be a lot of other ones, So I don't think the instrumental views preclude dealing with many of these kinds of questions. But I think you're right. Unresolved normativity, I appreciate the honesty, I do, but I would say there are these different levels here, and they just haven't really been sorted out, So that's right. You're definitely right about that, and that's something I'd have to be more clear about.
I was wondering if you are considering the chaos factor, because in this kind of riot, for example, I guess the unpredictable is an important factor to think about damage, because each person there has their own notion about property, and I don't think that is always ideological. action mostly. So if you think that it's an important factor to think about chaos, about the adrenaline, right? Because you are doing things that you have not wondering about that before. So it's my question: if you think that adrenaline is an important factor to think about this topic. Thank you.
Okay, all right, maybe someone will think of some. I hope people, yeah. So this is a great question about chaos, and there's so many reasons for it, right? So I'm a political theorist, right, but I'm also in a social science department. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about these protests, of course, if you look at the social science literature, is precisely what you're referring to as part of what happens. I mean, things get, I said, out of control. You know, there's adrenaline and people start doing all kinds of things they might not have planned on doing. I just think you can't deny that, you know, as a person looking at the world and as someone studying it, right? So then the question is, what do we do with that, right? And this is where I guess I do become, and I'm a little conflicted about this, all right? Because in a way what I'm doing is very traditional. I'm saying, I know that's what happens, but I want people, even in the heat of the moment, to begin to make, I mean, I think we need to begin thinking about these things. So I would prefer protest movements, even when the adrenaline's flowing, where people are like, I don't think it makes sense to torch that store, versus let's go, you know, which I mean, I you know, we all have, many of us are political people, and I have been, and I have gone to, didn't do that, but I've been at protests where I was, no, actually in Hamburg I have a friend who would say, you Americans, you've never seen a real protest. I'll take you to one. And we would go with the Autonomen, and it was like, oh my, you know, it was like, wow, that's pretty. Actually, no, with battles, the police and the squatters, and you know, so I, you know, I got a sense of the dynamic there, you know, and it wasn't just people marching around with a sign saying, right. So I do think it would be. So I'm partly trying to be respectful of the adrenaline and the chaos. And I'm also partly trying to say, nonetheless, not just because I'm a political theorist and I'm a professor, but you know, we want not just political action, but smart political action and responsible political action, so we have to think about that. And this is meant to be a contribution to how we might do that. Now you might say, legitimately, well, that's unrealistic because we know people are just going to go and do a lot of stuff, right? But I don't think that's actually true always historically. I mean, one of the interesting things to me, reading this literature, a lot of it is how, like, you know, for example, how a certain model of nonviolent disobedience, resistance, kind of went global, you know? I mean, in other words, you had Gandhi, King, these sort of canonical figures, and others as well, right? There's a lot of people doing this, but they're crucial. And then other people looking around saying we can learn from that. So instead of there being a mob, just being angry and whatever, pillaging a building, people saying, no, here's what we're going to do. Now, it may be true that that model has become out of date, doesn't work all the time, but it has produced some real results in places. I mean, there's a lot of really clear evidence about the effectiveness of these nonviolent movements, you know, for all kinds of really interesting reasons, you know, some of which Gandhi and King knew about in a way, and now the social scientists have sort of said, yeah, I mean, you know, for example, they seem very effective at, you know, at neutral. I mean, one thing you have to worry about, right, when you're trying to undertake changes, is neutralizing the military. If you and your friends grab guns, you're probably not going to do that. They're probably going to shoot back at you and say, aha. If you do, you know, not be Gandhi, but that kind of thing, it becomes more difficult for the military just to shoot at unarmed people without. And one of the things is also now a literature that's out there that's just really interesting about how, Marcus and I have been talking about this, these authoritarian populists, they're sort of learning not to, this is very disturbing, not to reproduce the mistakes of other authoritarian leaders in responding to nonviolent movements. So the Chinese are no longer engaging, like in Hong Kong, okay, it's been brutal, but they didn't just send troops in and say shoot them. They've used, you know, so they're using a lot of new techniques. So they use surveillance, for example, to know where the protesters are gathering. As the protesters, I'm reading about this, it's terrifying. As people are getting out of the subway to meet, there's somebody who just snatches them. So it's not even on the television because nobody even knows about this. So they've developed these really nasty little techniques as a way of avoiding some of the features of battles between nonviolent movements and these authoritarian states, which often had led to counterproductive results for the regimes, because they figured out that's not the way to go. We don't want to have martyrs, we don't want mass mobilization, we don't want elements of the military finding what, basically going over. So, okay, so that's also happening, but I do think historically you can see people can kind of learn from some of these things. So that's kind of this very modest attempt to say we need to talk about property destruction. And now again, this is just an academic's point. If you go and you go and go to the library and look for stuff on this, you don't find very much, which is really pretty astounding. So that's the aim at least. But I also don't want to be the guy who's and I feel maybe it's unavoidable. I don't think so. I see this more as a kind of conversation with some of these movements, and I don't want to be the guy saying, no, you can't do this. I don't think, although it's true to some extent because there has to be a tension between thinking and doing or whatever, theory and practice. Maybe I do. I will also say some of these really dumb examples that I talk about there, it's not just chaos, but they were agent provocateurs. And also, this sounds really stupid, but it's true. Like in Minneapolis, where things got out of control is people looted a liquor store and just started drinking, and then it became carnival-like in a bad way. And that, it's fun. It's a long story, but I actually know that area pretty well, and I was there because of my daughter, who goes to university. We went into a small shop that is near where this was, an old shop we used to go to. It's a long story, but the shopkeeper sort of said, yeah, things were okay, and then, people started drinking, it got out of control, and then it got nasty. And then I won't say what the shopkeeper said about the people who looted her store. She did not like them, obviously, right? But, even she was saying there was kind of a dynamic here. So anyhow, that's something one has to be aware of, and one has to think about, So, but yeah, it's complicated. Sorry, that's a really long answer, because it's something that I do been thinking a lot about.
You must say for the record that Scheuerman renounced being Lenin, so that he will just talk to the movement.
Renounced being Lenin. I thought you were going to say I renounced alcohol, which isn't true.
There's something I was thinking while you were answering the question, which is the difference, which is in a country in which you have to presuppose that every people or any person might be carrying a gun.
That's right. Yeah, this is another
issue.
So,
and this is something that we are experiencing in Brazil right now with Bolsonaro, because a lot of people are armed. But I think it gets the chaos and the determinacy get a little bit different out of control when that happens. And I think we're seeing a shift in direct violence to people in protests right now in Brazil, in which we're taking specific measures that were never taken before. Like Lula is now with a vest, like with a how do you call it? A
bulletproof
vest, exactly. Because political violence has, but I think that's something you're always putting into account in the U.S., right? People might go there armed.
Yeah, more and more. Yeah, it's changed, but for the worse. Yeah, you're right, absolutely right about this. Yeah, and that,
So, Bill, thank you very much for your lecture. I was a little reluctant to ask a question because I'm not familiar with this literature, but well, here it goes. Okay. Okay, so there you go. It makes it better. I think that I am convinced that to make this distinction about what is violent and what is not is very important. And I think this normativity issue that Gabriel brought up, I think the way I understood your argument, it seems to me that there is a very important normativity claim there when you differentiate the value of a person from the value of a thing. I think there is a normativity claim there. And I also think that it will be very interesting. I mean, one of your last, when you were answering Bianca, you mentioned that perhaps you should have to differentiate what type of property you're talking about. And I think there is a very interesting theoretical effort that you can explore. I don't know, that you can explore actually. By discussing, I mean, even reaching back to Locke and those classical thinkers and the way they linked life and property to make this distinction nowadays. I mean, it is clear that the life of a small shopkeeper depends on his property much more than, I don't know, a big millionaire who has a lot of assets. Yeah, there you go. There you go. There is a distance between their life and the property they have. So I think you can manage your way over there. When I was thinking about the question being, okay, let's damage a small shop or a Starbucks shop. I think that this is a path for you to make this differentiation. However, I was also thinking, and that's my question, isn't this distinction between destroying a small shop or a Starbucks shop really, in the last sense, a matter of what not of the technique you're using, not of if you're destroying, using violence or not, even in the sense that you proposed, but really, what are you destroying or what are you fighting against?
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And in this sense, all of this politically motivated property damage, they're symbolic, right? I mean, you said they kind of overlap,
Yes.
but I'm just thinking if this is not, a crucial distinction, and perhaps that's something that's present also in Martin Luther King. And here's where I'm not familiar with a broader literature, but who are people who are claiming that violent protests might be legitimate, but perhaps what they're calling attention to, or at least this is an argument that could be made, is that it doesn't really matter if you're using violence or not. It does matter what you're fighting against.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing, I think. And how would that, I don't know, relate to your argument? I think that's my question. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I meant to say, although I see why maybe that didn't work, is so one issue are the forms of property, okay, about which I said too little, and we can add something. It's even more complicated. I mean, I just, and you let me get away with this, okay? No, I said public property, we don't have to worry about it. No, it depends, if you destroy a public school, right? So that's not right either. So we're really talking about, you have to have a very complicated sort of story about property. But I think the more fundamental thing is you're right. I mean, the language I had about this was injustice. So there has to be some connection between whatever this damage or violation is and the cause. And I'm just kind of assuming this. It has to be, when I said sort of last resort sometimes, what I mean by that, this has to be serious. It's not just, my daughter is not captain of the soccer team, so I'm going to go smash the window of the coach's office in the school. I mean, no, right? So so you're absolutely right that the cause. I think there's only so far that a theory can speak to that. So the way the theorists will formulate this in this literature Marcus was talking about is you'll talk about extreme injustice, right? So these are things where the normal operations of the system either have not really addressed them or are incapable of addressing them, right? So, the canonical example for me, the civil rights movement, for a long time, Black Americans were trying to get the vote. And it was quite clear that was not going to happen, even though very mainstream political people, both on the left and the right, would say, oh, no, just keep lobbying Congress, and at some point, and if you know anything, right, and, it wasn't going to happen, clearly. There were movements towards it occasionally. So we're really talking about, certain types of injustice. That's kind of a given, and then there has to be a relationship between the damage or violation. That also, I would say, is a given. So, you know, I mean, so the Starbucks that we keep talking about, I guess we're picking on Starbucks, which is okay, but.
We should get a bank. Right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say.
Bank windows, because
Yeah.
here there's a lot of people, of fans of
Starbucks.
Vandalized windows. People are like crying over when protests happened in June 2013. The windows, they have been smashed.
Yeah.
Banks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think first these protests, global justice protests in Seattle, 1999. That's when that became, I think, what happened in Seattle. Banks, Starbucks, and the protesters did target chains. They didn't go to like Joe's coffee shop. And they're saying we're protesting this kind of global capital. So that was a point they were making, right? You know, maybe it wasn't a smart one, whatever, but that was the point, right? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. You know, but yeah, it gets. I mean, it's. So that's also one reason why I don't think there's a lot of stuff written on this, precisely because it seems the more I read about it, the more it seems to me this intangible thing we call political judgment. I mean, you have to know the context. You have to know the history. I mean, I can't come here. I mean, I have this nice slide, but it's ridiculous to me to sort of say in Brazil one could maybe do this. And not just because of the usual issues with that, but I just don't know enough about, you know, the struggles of this country, right? So that's another layer to it. So necessarily, this is now my apology for not really probably having told you anything you didn't already know that if you haven't thought about it, is this is going to have to operate at a kind of general level. Like, so here's some pointers, here's some general things for us to think about. And then one will have to think about what those, you know, violence doesn't mean this, and here are some conditions we might want to think about. You know, then you're going to have to think about what that means for particular moments, and nobody can, that's why politics is really hard, you know, and it requires thinking about what's new and what's not new, and not just applying a theory, but thinking about how, you know, the theory may or may not be useful. And it's also unavoidably the case that any theory certainly this is a situated theory. This is this guy from the American Midwest kind of trying to figure this out, and I'm sure somebody will come along and quite correctly say, here's where, you know, here's an element of this particular moment which is no longer relevant to us, which is here. Maybe that already happened today and I just didn't notice it, right? You know, so that's also very complicated, I think, about this. Okay, I'm talking too much again. It's very nice. I'm really enjoying your questions and the feedback.
Non-Leninist argument too.
A non-Leninist.
Non-Leninist.
Oh, non-Leninist. Good.
Yeah. I mean, that is something that the theoretician cannot solve for the participants.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if anyone has another comment or question regarding the answers. I don't think so. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, your comments. The lecture was really, really inspiring, and we now have the moment to chat a little bit with you and within yourselves in a small coffee break that's going to be outside. And thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.